Now, as we turn to China, we want to look at some of the high-level numbers that came out in the overnight. So industrial profits year on year came in at negative 6.7%. Industrial profits year to date coming at negative 15.5%. And when you look at the impacts, this is, again, why we keep highlighting why even falling sentiment, which it has been for GDP, is still too elevated, and we still expect to see some of that downward movement, especially when you start looking at some of the underlying. So manufacturing PMI was expected to be at 49.2, came in at 49.7. So again, some of that balancing act that we expect to see in some of the manufacturing, non-manufacturing, which is where we see or expect bigger declines over the coming few months, was expected at 51.2, came in at 51. So again, you're still getting this convergence in the middle. We just think that non-manufacturing is going to accelerate to the downside and cause some of those underlying problems. Now, the composite somehow came in at 51.3, which again, the math doesn't add up. So let's just call it something in a mixture of 50.3 is likely what they meant. That's probably a bad number or a misstruck number. But again, when you look at the U.S. direct investment into China falls as tension is rising, and we're not, there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of back and forth, but realistically, the U.S. and China are still at odds, and that's not going to get any better. And we were one of the largest investors in China, and the benefit of building in China has diminished really to be negligible, if anything negative, when you look at the labor cost differential. There's no point in shuttering something here and moving there. Actually, things are in the exact opposite. Now, looking at Michael Pettis, he had a great thread, and I want to read through his words to just highlight where things are, because I think it's really important when we look at some of these different pieces. So the claim that tariffs are good or tariffs are bad is ideology, not economics. What should matter instead to economists are the conditions under which tariffs can boost or restrain productivity growth within the economy. When tariffs simply interfere with the efficient distribution of production, they can indeed reduce global productivity. But when they are designed mainly to reverse mercantilist policies abroad that repress demand, they can boost total productivity and growth. And this is interesting because when you start looking at, state level influence and how that has impacted things, that's where you have to look at some of the pushback, because it's like, okay, well, what are you incentivizing? What is that gate? Why is that tariff there? Are you equalizing the playing field given the low cost nature or the subsidized nature you're getting at the point of production, and then, leveling it as it comes through? So in a well-functioning trade environment, the purpose of exports is to increase imports, in which case free trade tends to shift production to where it is most productive, and countries will not run large persistent trade surpluses or deficits. And that's when you saw that big pivot from the U.S. into China. You had a shift in production. They were more productive, lower cost, and there was free trade back into the U.S. Now that labor differential has gone away, but yet there's still some of these tariffs that China has against some of the components in the U.S., and now the U.S. has since responded. So, but in a world of huge persistent imbalances, which we've seen in a lot of areas where the U.S. is at a persistent deficit, other areas are at persistent surpluses, but in a world of huge persistent imbalances, policies in countries that achieve competitiveness through measures that subsidize domestic production at the expense of domestic demand, more exports result in trade surpluses rather than in imports. These measures can include direct subsidies as well as indirect ones, such as undervalued currencies, repressed interest rates, window guidance for credit allocation, repressed labor rights, and overspending on business-related infrastructure. Who is overspent on business-related infrastructure? In that case, the main purpose of trade in surplus countries is to allow them to externalize the cost of weak domestic demand by exporting more than they can import. But they are able to do so only to the extent that the deficit countries are willing to absorb this demand repression through higher and higher investment. If they are developing countries, or higher unemployment, or more likely higher debt if they are not. That is why if the purpose of tariffs and other trade and industrial policies is to protect an economy from having to absorb this repression of demand, they boost total production by forcing the surplus countries to reverse their own demand suppressing policies. The fact that advanced and developing economies run very large, persistent trade surpluses balanced by trade deficits mainly in advanced economies is prima facie evidence that global trade is demand suppressing rather than productivity enhancing. And this is interesting because it kind of cuts to the heart of the problem, especially when you look at this specific piece. This demand repression through higher investment if they are developing countries, or higher unemployment, or more likely higher debt. And a lot of that repression is still now more prevalent in China, but the debt side that was used to churn out a lot of this support, which came by way of those local government financial vehicles, which are repressing real demand and now are becoming a bigger issue when you look at trying to refinance and trying to get things on a firmer footing, which is why you've now seen the main benefit disappear. And now the productivity is being hit, and you're not willing, or countries are unwilling to invest more in China, as well as, again, pulling out and then buying their exports. They'd rather go elsewhere to get that export quantity, which is where you're starting to see these broader shifts. Now, when we start looking at some of the different pivots, this puts into perspective where we are on just the China industrial profits. But this, again, kind of cuts to the trade piece. China's working age population projected is extensively falling. China's total factor productivity growth annual change, you can see it's come down and continued to fall. So when you look at it, and there's other charts that show it closer to 1, there's no benefit in going there because, again, when you look at the productivity growth factor, it's negligible given distance coming to and from, and the fact that you have to get the raw materials there, assemble, either send the semi-finished product or the finished product somewhere else, which is why when you start looking at the privately owned companies shrinking since 2007 as a percentage and return on assets, and state-owned enterprises, again, kind of weighing on that, well, what's the point of going there versus another region? So then when we start honing in on that local government financing, China local government hidden debt seen above 50% of GDP. So this is debt that hasn't even hit the books yet, and that has to be recognized or realized, and you have to then track it back to who do you owe it to, because that could also be kind of a shadow way of repressing that consumer spending, because consumers might be holding it, or companies that consumers invested in, or trusts, or some sort of financial vehicle that was deemed safe given the fact that it was a government vehicle. Again, you have that issue. So the debt increase helped fund pandemic stimulus, but now what? And so China's LGFVs undergoing liquidity strain, cash on hand to pay short-term debt has steadily fallen. And this is when, for anybody that does fixed income, you have what's called your coverage ratio. And typically your coverage ratio is agreed upon depending on your investment grade, high yield. You know, is it 1 times coverage, 1.5, 4.5 times? You're here sub 0.5. So realistically, the collateral that's behind it, do you have enough? You know, or does there have to be a capital call because you need collateral against the LGFVs because you could be in breach of your terms? But is there any available? Because realistically, the provinces that have the highest level of debt are also the poorest ones, which wouldn't have the capital to put up as collateral. So China's LGFVs need constant financial injections to fund investments. So when you look at in general, business operations annual net cash flow is negative, investment annual net cash flow is negative, financing annual net cash flow is positive, but you're starting to see how the negative overwhelms, which is what we call the multiplier effect, where it's actually a negative multiplier. For every dollar you're investing, you're earning only 0.8 cents. So that means that for every dollar you're investing, you're only getting 80 cents back. That is a huge issue, especially when you look at China rich and poor regions. Borrowing costs are obviously diverging because I'm even though it's technically government backed, well, am I going to give a poor nation the same interest rate I would Beijing or Guangdong? Well, no. And that divergence creates a bigger issue, especially when you look at rolling debt and then actually bringing the unrecognized or off balance sheet back on balance sheet, because a lot of that is sitting at the poorer entities, which is only going to make their cash balances look worse, which then means that their financing costs are only going to get driven higher. Record number of LGFVs delaying payments to suppliers, companies late paying short-term debt issued to contractors such as construction firms. Number of LGFVs overdue on commercial paper is approaching 50%. So again, then the China's poorer areas face higher financing costs. So you can't pay who you've already lent to, and then this comes that cascading piece or that contagion, because now you're hitting the suppliers, and then the suppliers aren't getting the money they were promised, so then they can't pay their people, and then so again, you kind of see how this compounds on itself, and it's going to be at the poorest level. So China manufacturing PMI, coming in at 49.7, still, as we've been saying, it's kind of bouncing sideways. Non-manufacturing continuing its downtrend. We do see this going into negative territory. So improvements in manufacturing activity for new orders came in at 15.2. So it's, again, slight positive. But remember, we expected to see some pop because it was negative for so long. You're going to see some of that balancing act. Large enterprises PMI came in at 50.8%. 50.8%. The medium size enterprise came in at 49.6. Small enterprise 47.7. So again, better, but this is what we kind of been supporting, where things are not growing at 5%, nor are they at 4.5%, but they're also not negative. It's just things are looking better than they should, given some of the window dressing that we've seen. China's top 100 developers see August sales at 343 billion yuan, which is a decline of 33.9% year on year and down 1.3% month on month. China top 100 developers are just, you see that stress. And yes, what did China do? They cut mortgage rates for first-time home buyers. They cut mortgage rates for first and second-time home buyers. They cut down payment requirements. The problem is people don't have the money to afford it. They also have losses that they have realized that they can't turn around and roll. So even though they say that, oh, well, your down payment is lower, they're sitting there saying, I don't have that down payment anymore, so it doesn't matter. China housing slump has lasted more than 2 years. China allowed large cities to cut down payments for home buyers and encourage lenders to lower rates on existing mortgages in its latest attempts to halt the slide in country's government residential properties. Then when we look, the nationwide minimum down payment will be 20% for first-time home buyers and 30% for second-time purchases. China is accelerating efforts to reverse a real estate downturn that's threatening to derail growth in the world's second largest economy. Home sales slumped for the third straight month in August, and one of the country's biggest developers is on the brink of default. Beijing is betting that lower mortgage rates and down payments will revive demand for homes. We're saying no. Falling sales have led to mounting financial distress with Country Garden Holdings. And again, there's no magic bullet. And the problem when we look at the lack of magic bullet is that you also have a leverage issue that is we're unable to de-lever, which is, again, some of the bigger issues that we continue to see, especially when you look at, again, kind of that 2023 trend, just how low we are. We're making new lows for what the cumulative floor space for real estate. You get an idea of that building headwinds. Now, even though China has approved the cut, China lowers minimum down payment, PBOC lowers down payment for first and second-time home buyers, you're still not drumming up new demand. Chinese consumers spent less on cars and home appliances. So what do? They spent money on going out, cooking oil and food, tobacco, liquor, catering services, beverages, things to have fun, make merry. But then physical things that they'd have to go out and purchase, petroleum and related products. People are not traveling the same way. Cars, cosmetics, household appliances, gold and silver, building and decoration materials, office supplies. Things are just not the same way. There's that bifurcation where people are still eating out. They're still trying to meet with people that they weren't able to see for so long, but within reason, because they're not traveling the same way. They're not buying goods the same way. They're sticking with their services, which for anybody that's been following post-COVID in Europe, in the US, everywhere else, manufacturing doesn't really recover. Services bounces, but and then slowly comes down as people kind of catch up. And that's where we see additional headwinds. China's government has reduced spending this year, which is a problem because they're reducing spending, but yet they have to cover more debt. So this is also a deflation, or I should say negative GDP growth, because remember, what is GDP but consumer plus investment plus government plus imports minus exports. So I'm sorry, exports minus imports. So when you look at it, government, G, being down is another headwind to underlying GDP growth, which is why we continue to talk about these pressure points. Now, kind of putting a bow on this, the Chinese property market is likely the largest asset class in the world. So write-downs have reverberating impacts because not only Chinese entities own Chinese property. So putting Chinese property market in perspective, cutting tax on trading and asking banks not to sell equities, and then reducing cost on mortgages will not solve the underlying problems. You essentially have to rebalance some of this market into other areas of the economy, which takes time, takes deleveraging, takes pain. Like this is a structural problem, not just a cyclical problem, which is why the issues remain where they are. The significance of trust companies have diminished, trust assets and loans, and a lot of this is because of write-downs, because of adjustments that have happened over time. Trust companies' exposure to real estate has shrunk, but again, it's shrunk more by force, not by willingness, which is why they've had to take down these write-downs. And now people that were exposed to them, consumers, they had that write-down pass through, which is why we see some of those additional pressure points. Now, in Japan, consumer confidence came in a bit lower at 36.2. Industrial production came in negative as the BOJ, again, struggles. And when you look at the struggle, the BOJ is set to buy the largest amount of bonds on record. That's not a good thing. When you think about the end of QE or this experiment, this is how it ends. It's that you keep pushing and pushing and pushing until you physically can't do any more. And that's going to happen when you look at the yen, which we think is going to break to 150 sooner rather than later. And you're going to see a lot of additional pressure points on that market. South Korea industrial production rolled over a bit, as South Korean industrial production in general. Then when you look at exports, again, things are still on the slower side. And there's a lot of problems in Asia, a lot of them with China. But again, they're problems that are resulting right now in a bigger slowdown versus estimates. And then as things kind of level off, that's what they're going to do. They're going to level off. They have to kind of balance themselves. And as we talked about in segment 1, China and the PBOC has been selling treasuries to pull in dollars, to then use those dollars to then kind of balance and support their currency, as we've shown before with the support they've stepped in with on the yuan basis, on the renminbi basis. And that they're going to do that as long as they can, because there's a lot of pressure against their debt. But once kind of the yen cracks a bit, they'll get a little bit of freedom, and we do expect them to start buying treasuries. Like, this isn't something where they're sitting there and playing 4D chess and selling this to screw up and make things worse for the U.S. It's the opposite. They're doing it because they have to, and then they would quickly look to rebuy some of these things, because a lot of this is collateral that they're going to have to backstop, and it brings in dollars that they need in order to maintain their FX reserves, because for some reason 3 trillion is a very important number in people's minds, and they want to maintain over 3 trillion in FX reserves, which makes sense, especially when you look at the write-downs they're taking. They've extended the life the duration of debt. They have to keep rolling debt at higher and higher rates. And again, there's a lot of problems that remain. And this is, again, structural, not something where a little bit of pain and then all of a sudden China is growing at 7% next year. That's not the case. This is going to be a perpetual issue, which is why we talk so much about global economic slowdown. This is not just one area. This is a global issue which will continue. So that's what we have for you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And we hope you enjoy your Labor Day weekend. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.